Okay, thanks everybody. My name is Jeremy Wildeman. I'm a scholar both at the Human Rights Centre at the University of Ottawa and adjunct lecturer at Carleton University, amongst many other roles. We're very lucky here today to have with us today MP Heather McPherson. And if you're not familiar with Heather, she's represented the riding of Edmonton-Strathcona in the House of Commons. Do we have anybody from Edmonton here? No. One. I'm from Saskatchewan originally. Battlefords. Somebody from Saskatchewan. In the House of Commons since October 2019, so going on 5 years now. Prior to becoming an MP, you've spent over 20 years working on sustainable development and international cooperation efforts through the nonprofit sector, including 10 years as Executive Director of the Alberta Council for Global Cooperation. She worked closely with the Canadian and international community, focusing on sustainable development, good governance, and human rights. Heather's currently serving as the New Democratic Party Deputy Whip, Critic for Foreign Affairs, Critic for International Development, and Deputy Critic for Canadian Heritage, and you previously served as Deputy House Leader. I'm going to very quickly add that the conference reached out to several MPs from all major Canadian political parties to ensure that we hear the views of all parties on Canada's Middle East policy. But only MP McPherson accepted the invitation to join us here today to discuss the current government's approach to the region and what should or should not be done by Canada. So the structure of the session is we're going to have a 5 to 7 minutes for MP McPherson to answer a question that I sent in advance. And that's actually a few questions. Then we're going to have a bit of a conversation for 15 to 20 minutes, following up on those opening remarks and some other questions that I provided in advance. And then about 2 minutes for closing remarks. Okay, does that sound good so far?
Perfect.
Okay. So the opening questions that we're going to start with were, what role do you think Canada can and should take in response to the violence in the Middle East, notably in Gaza, Lebanon, Israel, and increasingly in other regions like Syria, Yemen, and Iraq? I've left Iran out for a reason. Is there anything that can be done specifically in the current Parliament? From your perspective, why should Canada be involved in the first place? So thanks.
So thanks, Jeremy. First of all, that's a lot of questions. So if I don't get to them, circle back and I'll make sure I try to get there as we go through. First of all, it's really nice to see everyone here today. And I want to start by acknowledging the pain that so many people across Canada and around the world are feeling right now. I think it's really important that we remember, as we start these conversations, that there are people in almost every room that we are in right now who are worried about loved ones, who have lost people that are close to them. We know that this conflict that is happening right now between Israel and Palestine has cost over 200 United Nations workers their lives, that humanitarian workers are being targeted, that journalists are being targeted, and of course, so many innocent civilians, predominantly women and children, have already lost their lives. And I want to make some space for that and for the pain that we know so many people are feeling. Canada's role in the world. I shouldn't do the deep sighs with my microphone, but what Canada needs to be doing right now, I mean, realistically, I have talked to people from coast to coast to coast who are so deeply disappointed in the response of the government of Canada right now. And I have spoken to people that are part of, the communities that might be more directly impacted, people who are from Palestine, people who are Muslim, Arab, Jewish, Israeli. I've spoken to those communities, but I've also spoken to Canadians that are not part of those communities. In my office alone, we've received hundreds of thousands of emails from people that are asking why the Canadian government isn't taking the necessary steps to stop the bloodshed, to make sure that hostages are returned, to do everything within our power. And so for me, there's some really clear, easy things that the government of Canada needs to do. And we can go over that later on. We can go into more detail. But listen, we are a G7 country. I recognize Canada does not have the largest voice on the international stage, but we are a G7 country, and we have the ability to change the conversation. And there are key things that need to happen right now. You know, we have been calling since the very beginning, of course, days after October 7th for a ceasefire, but we have been calling on sanctions. Sanctions not just on the extremist settlers in the West Bank, but we need to sanction Netanyahu and his extremist cabinet, and that needs to be done immediately. If this was any other conflict, when we saw what Putin did with Ukraine, the sanctions of Russian officials started immediately, and we need to put those sanctions in place. We need to stop sending weapons. And again, listen, like, I get it. We're not the ones that are sending the vast majority of weapons that the Israeli military is using on civilians. We know right now that Canada is not a military superpower. That's clear. But the idea that we cannot stop the transfer of arms to a regime that is using it against innocent people during a genocide is appalling. And yes, Melanie Joly has talked about the fact that she has stopped some of the weapons from going. Every single military piece of equipment should not be able to go. And it should not be able to go through the United States to other countries to be used against their citizens. And right now what we're seeing with Israel, that's happening. But this has been happening for a very long time, and we've been calling it out for a long time. It happens with Saudi Arabia. It happens with other countries where the military-grade goods go to the U.S. and then go to other countries. You know, these are things that need to be put in place, and they need to be put in place now. And frankly, just to end, I guess, on this one, the idea that the country of Canada is not adhering to international law, to international humanitarian law, is so appalling for so many of us. You know, we were one of the architects of the international criminal justice system, the ICC and the ICJ. And then to say that in certain circumstances we would adhere to that, but in other circumstances we won't. To say that sometimes the rule-based international order applies and other times it does not. That's not the role we need for Canada. We need leaders who have the courage to say that in every circumstance, regardless of which human being, humanitarian law, international rules-based systems apply equally. And that's not what we're seeing from this government right now.
Thank you.
Did I get them all?
You did, I think. And it actually segues to the next question, because you're talking about the international law, rules-based system. How do you see the dynamic of the Middle East being affected by the election of Donald Trump to the White House, and how might this shape Canada's own engagement with the region?
Yeah, I was in Milwaukee actually during the election. I was part of I see the senator here was part of my team. He led the delegation from Canada. And I was heartbroken. I was heartbroken with the results of that election. And I mean, let me say, the thing that I've sort of been reflecting on for a while now is the idea that for me, you know, I'm going to be fine. For most of us in this room, we're going to be fine. A Trump election means chaos, it means confusion, it means a lot of things. But for most of us, we're going to be okay. But you know, the kid who sent me a message because she's trans and she lives in San Francisco and she's worried about getting put in a camp, that kid's not going to be fine. You know, people in Ukraine aren't going to be fine. People in Palestine aren't going to be fine. So I'm deeply worried about what a Trump election means, and not just a Trump election. I mean, the bananas appointments that we saw to his cabinet, like these are ideologues. These are power hungry people. You know, I know it's not related to this topic, but for a moment, let's consider that the United States has elected a convicted rapist and then put in charge another person who has been accused of trafficking children, and put him in charge of the organization that will determine whether he was trafficking children. Like, this is so outside of the norm that I think we really need to be concerned. And I know there will be a lot of politicians that will want to say, let's play nicely, this is important. I'm not going to do that. Donald Trump is a fascist, and I am not going to play nicely with fascists. In terms of what Canada needs to do, now more than ever, we need Canada to stand up. And let me tell you, we have a history. Canada's foreign policy has not always gone in lockstep with the United States foreign policy. We have our own foreign policy. We have our ability to walk our own path, and we have had the courage in the past to do that. The fact that now we seem to feel like our foreign policy needs to be completely in line with the United States is wrong. You know, I think of conservative governments. I think about under Brian Mulroney and South African apartheid, where we had the courage. You know, I think about under the Liberal government with Lloyd Axworthy, when he actually said, he told me a story once about how Madeleine Albright had said, no, you're never going to get the votes to start the international criminal court system. And he said, I'm going to get the votes. And then he went and he did that. You know, like, we have had a foreign policy that is brave, and we can have that foreign policy again. One last thing, though. I think it's important to note, as terrifying as a Trump presidency is, I am not prepared to let Biden off the hook for what he also has done over the last year. You know, Biden also enabled Netanyahu to continually escalate the attacks on the Palestinian people. And he would draw red lines in the sand and then march right over them. So I am not prepared to give the Democrats a free pass either. And for some time, Canada should have been walking a path very different from what the United States was doing.
How do you think Canada should engage with Iran, given the dynamics we have discussed of the current conflict in the Middle East and the potential return by the United States to a campaign of maximum pressure? I think the cabinet appointments are hinting at that. We're seeing that this campaign will get underway.
Yeah, I mean, listen, Iran is a horrendous regime. The regime, the IRGC, is horrendous. I shouldn't say Iran, because the Iranian people are some of the strongest people, you know, we've seen pushing back over the last few years. The women, peace, freedom movement and all the things that they are doing. But this is a regime that shot a plane full of people that were coming to Canada out of the sky. It was one of the very first things that I encountered as a member of Parliament. I was elected and put into place, and that was the first major crisis we dealt with. And of course, Edmonton, Strathcona was particularly impacted because of the University of Alberta. Iran is a horrendous actor. However, I want to be clear. We cannot support a bombing of Iran if it means that again we have innocent civilians being targeted. I think we need to find ways to hold Iran to account. Certainly, even what we're seeing with regards to foreign interference, we know that Iran is in Canada. The regime is in Canada, intimidating and threatening Canadian citizens, influencing our politics. That needs to stop. The IRGC, I brought forward a study asking why it was taking the government so long to recognize the IRGC as a terrorist entity, and what steps needed to be put in place to ensure that innocent people were protected if they had been conscripted. Even just this spring, we were able to bring in the Tumaj sanctions to make sure that we're using the sanction regime as effectively as we could against IRGC. I think that's a key thing that Canada can and should continue to do.
How do you see a potential Conservative government handling foreign policy from Canada, Canadian Conservative government, with a particular focus on the Middle East?
Well, it's terrifying.
Assuming you don't win.
I don't know. Nobody asks me. I'm not the one that gets to make the decision on when the next election is. But yeah, if the polls are right, we're looking at a Conservative government. And that is terrifying, and that should be terrifying for all of us, because it's very clear by the language that we have heard out of Pierre Poilievre and out of Michael Chong, frankly, his foreign affairs minister, where they stand with regards to this conflict. Pierre has made it extraordinarily clear one of the first things he will do is stop funding to UNRWA. At a moment in time where we have a humanitarian crisis where children are starving to death in Gaza, to stop the funding of UNRWA is unconscionable. And he will use that weaponization of UNRWA that we saw earlier since October 7th to say that that's why. You know, there was a good example, like I think it might even have been Ambassador Allen who brought it forward to Foreign Affairs, that talked about the idea that, you know, if you looked at the police service of New York City and you said there are a few cops on the force that are doing bad stuff, you would never, ever consider getting rid of the entire police force. You know, for me, the idea that they would defund UNRWA is so dangerous, especially at this moment in time. But also the fact that their you know, unwavering support of Netanyahu and uninterest in actually dealing with a international legal system is so dangerous for us, for Canada's role in the world, for our reputation, for so much, and so dangerous for the people that are living in Palestine and Lebanon and in the region. You know, just to give you an example, I had just raised this with somebody just a few moments ago, but to give you an example, we had a debate in the House of Commons. I'd asked for an emergency debate when the conflict, when Israel was bombing Lebanon, and we were so deeply worried because, of course, we've got an enormous number of people that from Lebanon that live in Canada. This is an important issue for us, and of course, you know, watching the escalation and the spreading of this conflict is so dangerous and difficult for all of us. So we had an emergency debate on what was happening in Lebanon. And during that debate, I actually said to Michael Chong, who is their foreign affairs critic, and someone who I think of as a friend, and someone who I think in many instances with regards to foreign affairs is relatively reasonable. And I said, have you seen, can you honestly say you've not seen a single instance by Netanyahu and the Israeli military that is gone against international law? Have you not seen a single instance where you could criticize this administration for their behavior? And he unequivocally said there was he had seen nothing that they had done wrong, that there was nothing that had been done wrong. And this was after Canadians had been killed, innocent Canadians. This was after, you know, tens of thousands of innocent children had died. The targeting of journalists, the targeting of UN workers. This was after the bombing of UNIFIL and the Irish UN workers. And yet, not one thing, not one example could he say was a problem. Like none of the illegal settlements, none of that. So for me, I'm worried what a next administration looks like. And so it's why I've been pushing so hard to get the government to take some steps now. We need some bold steps to be taken now that can be put in place in the event that the Conservatives win a next election. And that involves recognizing the state of Palestine. That involves long-term funding for UNRWA. That involves putting sanctions in place that hold those responsible for this genocide accountable.
Kind of a follow-up question to a lot of points. How can Canada better represent Canadians with family and cultural connections and even other ties to the Middle East? And how are we doing right now?
Well, you know, we have to listen to them. We have to be having those conversations, and I don't think that's happening. I mean, I should be on this stage with a representative from every political party in this country. And every single political party should be able to discuss and defend the position that their party has taken with regards to this conflict. But I'm alone up here. Not one of them wanted to come and explain their position. You know, if the Conservatives are so proud of their stance on the Middle East, where are they? Why won't they talk to us about it? Why can't we have a conversation about it? You know, I spent the summer going from coast to coast, meeting with people and talking to folks that are impacted. You know, even just a few days ago, I met with the daughter of one of the hostages who lost her life on October 7th, Judy Weinstein. And I met with the daughter who just wants her mother's body back. You know, this is such a horrific and painful experience. I didn't walk. I'm not that ambitious. I went across the country this summer and I spoke to folks who said they feel like they're second-class citizens in this country. They feel like they don't belong in this country, that they feel like their government doesn't see their human rights as being as valid as other people's human rights. That's horrible for Canada, for a country of immigration, for a country of people from all over the world. For certain individuals to feel like their government doesn't see them, doesn't recognize their humanity, doesn't see them as being equal to other Canadian citizens. I mean, it makes me want to weep. I mean, we should all be concerned when this is how people within our communities are feeling. So for me, the first thing you need to do is we need to be talking to people. We need to be listening. We need to be hearing the pain in their stories. And then we need to be responding. And we also have to be aware, too, that what is happening right now in the Middle East is impacting every community in this country as well. You know, there are folks dealing with unbelievable hate, anger, racism, anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Semitism all across this country. And that needs to be something the Canadian government needs to deal with as well.
So one last question before your closing remarks. How does the current conflict in the Middle East affect Canadian security, including questions it has raised about the efficacy of international law? So how is our security internationally and domestically, maybe?
So the thing that I think most about this is that the whole world watched as Canada responded to the illegal invasion by Putin into Ukraine. The whole world saw how we responded to that. And you know, I was proud that we stood with Ukraine, that we stood with international law. You know, I'm impressed with the Canadian government for putting so much effort into returning children from Ukraine, for example. And then, you know, within the same sort of period, the world watched how we responded to a conflict in the Middle East. And all of a sudden, the human rights of some people were privileged and the human rights of other people were forgotten. And I think about, for the rest of the world, as we are trying to build a world where there is international rules, where there is democracy, you know, where human rights are protected for all people, and developing democracies or other countries see Canada, a country that, you know, I think we can all agree has historically sort of punched above its weight with regards to human rights, sees Canada not show up, not only not show up, but actually be part of the problem, not follow our own laws, you know, not follow the Arms Trade Treaty legal obligations that we have, not follow, you know, if Canada's a signatory to the Genocide Convention, and yet we don't do anything to live up to our obligations under that. I mean, the rest of the world looks at that and thinks, you know, you can only imagine that they would be thinking, why would we trust Canada? Why would we want to work with Canada? Why would we believe Canada is a honest broker in building peace in the world when we see the way it looks in different places? You know, one of the things for me that was the most shocking from the Canadian government is the almost price tag that was put on human rights with regards to who could get to safety. You know, when we heard 40,000 Afghans after the Taliban took over and people were trying to flee for their safety. And then we heard unlimited Ukrainians. And then we heard 500 Sudanese. And then we heard 1,000 Palestinians. And you just think to yourself, like, does nobody recognize that's a horrible thing to put on someone's humanity? We'll take any of you. We'll take some of you. We'll take a handful of you, and frankly, we won't work very hard, so probably none of you will get here. You know, and just a smidgen of you. Like, what a message to send to the world. And in a world that's changing, in a world where there is not just the G7, where the African Union is learning how to work better as a group, when it is the fastest growing continent, where other countries are working together and are creating a new world order. And Canada comes to the table with these crumbs. It's a problem, and it is something we will pay for. We, for a long time, have privileged trade over many of our human rights obligations, over many of our development obligations, over many of our peacekeeping obligations. We have a smattering of peacekeepers in the field right now. And I have to say that trade is what you get when you do the hard work of building relationships, of building diplomacy, of building peacekeeping. It's not the reason it's that we have these relationships. And so we've already had some problems with our foreign policy from my perspective. I think of what an actual feminist foreign policy should and could look like for this government, and that's not what I see.
And just a couple more minutes for closing remarks. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I mean, I started off by acknowledging that there is a lot of pain across this country, and I think that's why we all have to continue to do this work. That's why we all have to continue to keep pushing and keep fighting for Canada to do those things that need to be done. I've long said recognizing the state of Palestine is not going to help the children who don't have food today, but it does build towards a peace for later. And I think that is something we really need to focus on as well. We need to build a potential for peace going forward. So Canada should be recognizing Palestine. The minister could do that today. She could do that just by walking up to a microphone. I'm working with colleagues from New Zealand and Australia. We have members of parliament from 9 parties across those 3 countries who have signed on to a letter that we'll be releasing on Wednesday, asking our governments to act, because we do know that they tend to feel safer acting together. The sanctioning of the extremists and Netanyahu and his cabinet need to be undertaken fast. The government needs to do what steps can be done now, because we don't know when the next election is. But I also think we need to have a real conversation about Canada's role in the world, about our adherence to international law, and we need to have a real conversation about what comes next. Because Gaza, Palestine, it's going to need to be rebuilt. Ukraine's going to need to be rebuilt. I asked the minister in the Foreign Affairs Committee if he would guarantee that no Canadian dollars would go to a rebuilding unless we could ensure that there was the right to return for Palestinians. He couldn't give me an answer. There will need to be difficult conversations as we go forward on how we rebuild, how we make sure that those who have perpetrated these crimes are held accountable, how we rebuild Palestine, and how we ensure that we don't have another conflict that costs tens of thousands of innocent lives down the road. That ultimately the peace that we all want, the peace that is for all Israelis and all Palestinians, is a diplomatically determined peace. We cannot bomb our way to peace. We cannot bomb. There is no military solution here. There is just a diplomatic solution. And Canada can and should be playing a key role in that.
So your conversation and following, a lot of what you said, I'll just note, will tie into the panel we'll be having expert panel at 4:45 p.m. International law after Gaza, the crisis of rules or system breakdown. I don't know if you can join us for that, but still stay with us. But a lot of what you've spoken about touches on the importance of international law and the protections it brings, and your concern about the breakdown of international law, in addition to what it means internally in Canada. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.